is Tor Bair. I'm the head of growth at Enigma, which is a privacy-focused project here in the blockchain space, and I am presenting today the case for privacy. This is a presentation that I gave this week at a conference here in Chicago. I don't know if it's been recorded, but I decided to re-record the whole thing for the community just in case and clean it up a little bit and help you guys understand why privacy is so important fundamentally, not just to Enigma as a project, not just to me personally, but why it needs to be so fundamentally important to all of us as humans and as individuals and as people who are trying to build a better, more sustainable, democratic future for everyone. So this presentation is just about privacy itself. It's about the why of privacy, right? Not technological in any sense. It's just about why we should all care and why now more than ever. But, you know, before we can really talk about the why, we have to talk about the what. You know, what even is privacy? And privacy is not something that's very easy to explain because it's very hard to see, very hard to touch. So I started by saying, you know, let's find a visualization of privacy. So I searched for stock images of privacy, and this is what I got. And if you were to believe this, then it sounds like privacy is a bunch of security cameras, which actually sounds a lot more like surveillance. Or maybe privacy is a pair of binoculars powered by Facebook, and that is definitely surveillance. So this doesn't seem right at all. This isn't what I would call privacy. So I tried again. I tried to Google images of privacy and people, you know, like privacy person, privacy human, and then this is what I got. And this is probably even worse. I think that's Mark Zuckerberg on the left and his trademark hoodie, and then on the right, I believe that's also Mark Zuckerberg at home, you know, sitting in the dark on Facebook. And neither of these really have much to do with privacy at all. This makes privacy seem like something that it isn't. So let's talk about what privacy isn't. Privacy is not, you know, having something to hide. It's not this idea of wanting to be alone and away from people. It's not being suspicious. It's not using dark colors or wearing dark clothing, right? This is what, you know, if you think about privacy, this might be what comes to mind. But this is not privacy. Privacy at its core is a fundamental human right. And it's for that reason that, you know, I'm using bright pink colors in this presentation, because that's what privacy really is. It has everything to do with how we exist and celebrate the fact that we are individuals and that we are human. So in order to understand privacy, I'm going to break it down into things that maybe are a little more tangible, some ideas and elements that we are more familiar with. One of which is going to be this idea of consent, one of which is going to be this idea of freedom, and one of which is going to be this idea of sustainability and sustainable systems. I'm hoping by the end of this presentation I've convinced you that each of these three things has much more to do with privacy than dark colors or Mark Zuckerberg or anything else that came before this in the presentation. So let's jump right in. Privacy as consent. So again, we need definitions. In the context of privacy, I would say that a good definition for consent would be agreeing to what can be done with our information or our data. And then at the same time, you need to have knowledge of and you need to be informed about this agreement. It's not just enough to check a box that said, I read all the terms and conditions, especially if you didn't, right? You have to actually know what you're consenting to. And violations of our privacy, right? We don't always feel them, but they're often violations of our consent. And let me give you one very specific, obvious example of when we can see a violation of consent that's really a violation of our privacy. I think many people watching this are going to be very familiar with this. This was the Cambridge Analytica scandal that had Facebook in the news pretty much daily for the better part of last year. And, you know, the way that this was described, it's very clear, right? This was an issue of consent. Data was taken without authorization. Profiles were being harvested, and then that same data was being used to target the individuals whose data had been collected without their consent, you know, and it was used for influencing, let's say, votes like in Brexit or the US elections, right? That was a huge violation of consent because people had taken what was essentially a personality test, and then suddenly, you know, even if just your friend had taken that test, your data was now available to be used for doing this kind of targeting. That was not consent, and that is a privacy violation. But the good news is that it ended here. Nothing else happened. Facebook didn't have any issues going beyond Cambridge Analytica. Except that last week, it came out again. Facebook suspended tens of thousands of applications as part of this privacy investigation. It's really obvious that we don't actually know how deep this problem goes. We don't know where our data went. We don't know who reused it. We don't know if there were any controls behind it. And the fact is, Facebook doesn't know either. How many apps actually went beyond the agreements that users signed in having their data be used? And a bigger question than that is, who's responsible? You know, you might think that it's Facebook, the platform, but maybe it's the application that actually misused the data. That's certainly Facebook's perspective. Or maybe it's the users who actually agreed to the terms and conditions. Maybe that's the perspective of the applications. Maybe the users feel like the government should have stepped in and regulated Facebook to force them to do something about protecting their data. And ultimately, there's not a clear answer to this question. It might be that all of these parties are actually responsible, but I can definitely tell you who it seems to hurt the most, and that's us, the individuals. The irony here is that this is a privacy problem, but it's also a transparency problem. We don't know what we don't know. We don't know what Facebook knows. That problem of not knowing is why we don't understand how big of a problem this is. And the fact that there is so little transparency about how these deals were being made and what we were agreeing to, that's what created the problems in the first place. And you can see how having a lack of transparency or accountability for all of those parties that I just mentioned is what really creates these problems of privacy, especially privacy as consent. So how do you consent to what you don't understand? I'm not sure you can. And then even more so, how do you regulate it? How do you regulate a problem you can't understand? And that's the question facing governments right now. You know who has an answer to that? Mark. So Mark says to Congress, please regulate us, right? He writes a blog post, for Facebook saying, here's how you should regulate us. It gets covered in the New York Times, in TechCrunch, everywhere. Why would Facebook want regulation? The steps are actually pretty straightforward. Step one is you create this massive, complex system and create tons of negative externalities for consumers that you're not held accountable for. And then each of those consumers really has no visibility into the magnitude of those problems. And then step two, I think you already know, is profit. The problem happens when there suddenly is a little bit of accountability, when people figure out that this is happening and that consumers are bearing the burden. So step three is get caught. And Facebook clearly was not able to defend the misuse of user data on their platform. But because of step two, they could use profits to then influence the governments charged with regulating them, now being able to credibly claim that only Facebook could understand the problem that they created, which means only they can create the rules, which means these are the only rules that should be followed and only Facebook is capable of following them. And now suddenly this has become deeply anti-competitive, not pro-consumer. This is regulatory capture. So the reason this feels so icky, right, is not just because this was a violation of our privacy, that somebody somewhere found out something about our personalities or about our taste in books or movies. It's a violation of our consent, and that we do feel. We feel it in every aspect of our lives. This violation of our privacy violated something deeply human and deeply fundamental to us. Now, that brings me pretty quickly to the next point, which is privacy as freedom. And again, we're going to do a quick definition, mostly in the context here of privacy again. But freedom to me meaning the power and the right to act and speak and think as you desire. And maybe freedom means the pursuit of happiness, right? To put it in more of an American context. But it's maybe not a guarantee of happiness, but at least the right to pursue it freely. Now, privacy is essential not only to that individual freedom, that individual pursuit of happiness, but it's also essential to our collective freedom within a society. And rather than explain why from scratch, I'm going to quote from Privacy International, who wrote a great piece about this. And they argue that the right to privacy and the right to freedom of expression are actually really the same concept. this idea that we can maintain a private life and private communications, that's all well and good. But what happens when surveillance is used to suppress that speech? What's happening is we're being told to have this right of free expression, but then we're not being protected from the consequences of that expression, right? That's something that governments and platforms work together on. They can help really in suppressing speech by not protecting us from the consequences because they're surveilling us, even if they're simultaneously encouraging us to share and overshare. So this sort of indirect suppression is actually more dangerous. To quote directly from that same article, states tell us that stability cannot be ensured if anonymous online expression is unregulated, that communications must be visible by the state in order to prevent terrorism and cybercrime, that interactivity without observability would lead to illegality. All of these are false choices. This is not something that we have to choose between. And making us choose between it is really just opting into the type of surveillance or surveillance capitalism that is oppressing human freedoms today. And again, an irony, expressing this right to privacy, right? This idea that we have a right to privacy means expressing a freedom to speak publicly. Again, privacy is not wanting to do things out of the public eye in the privacy of your own home, maybe, or like hiding your identity from others. It just means we want to be able to speak our opinions publicly and form an identity without being, afraid of retribution from the same people who are giving us the platform for free expression. And we're at danger of losing that right. Imagine, right? This is maybe not something that's going to be immediately obvious to those of us in Western cultures, but in many places, if somebody were to know, somebody with control over society or your livelihood knew which websites you visited, the books you read, the items you buy, anyone that you speak to, anybody that you chose to love, right? And that you have to be afraid of the consequences of those decisions. You ask, what would they do if they knew? And you want to express that right to privacy, that right to expressing your identity without fear of retribution. And then I thought about it a little longer. I think we actually are very cognizant of this because Facebook already knows all these things. Facebook knows exactly what websites we visit, and we tell it which TV shows we watch and which books we read. We tell it our relationship status. They see all of our conversations. This is something that we're already telling all of these platforms. And these platforms sometimes have broader reach than the countries we live in. And that's something unprecedented in the whole of human history. And there's even less oversight of these same companies. So what is the consequences for us and our freedoms if companies already know all of this? And that creates another question. What happens when all of this links back to money, our actual livelihood? Spending and free markets is a form of individual freedom. Choosing what we consume, choosing what we spend on. Now we have this massive coming currency war. Central bank-backed digital currencies, or even something like Facebook's Libra. But this is the next frontier. And I don't think we understand yet the consequences of having this perfectly surveillable money and what that might mean for human freedom. And it's a little out of scope for this whole presentation, but obviously you can see why this is especially resonant inside the decentralization and blockchain space. So this leads me to the third element of privacy that I want to discuss, which is sustainability. And again, for the last time, this is going to require a definition. Sustainability means creating systems that can maintain their balance instead of requiring this sort of insatiable growth cycle in order to sustain themselves. And it also means increasing the resilience of the systems that we depend on and that we rely on in our day-to-day lives because they are so foundational to our society. And what I'm hoping to show in the next few slides is that systems that can't provide privacy are unsustainable for the humans in them. And this is the link between privacy and sustainability that I consider to be so important. So I want to start with a quote. Information wants to be free. You might have heard this quote. It's part of a Stewart brand quote. Does information want to be free? If you are familiar with the quote, you may be familiar with the other half of the quote, which goes, information wants to be expensive because it's so valuable. And here's this tension, right? The cost of acquiring data today is actually decreasing dramatically, especially for monopolistic platforms or for governments. That's because they control the systems that curate and collect and just hoover up as much data as possible. And the marginal cost of acquiring that data is coming down. Meanwhile, the value of that data, because it's being collected, because it's being processed, the value has never been greater. So what do you do with information that is cheap to gather and extremely valuable to hold, right? This obviously creates a system where everybody wants as much of it as possible. And Cory Doctorow wrote this great response to this quote. This is an old article now, but the point is as true as ever, which is it's the people, not the information, who really want to be free. And that has real consequences. There's now this tension, right? Like constant pull between the information wanting to be freely accessible, but the value of that information being huge. Like it's obvious that any platform like Facebook or Google is not going to willingly give it up. They're not going to give up the data. They're also not going to give up the systems that generate the data. They're not going to give up the control that they've managed to build, right? By having these massive centralized platforms with very little oversight. No oversight of how that data is being collected or consumed. So unsustainable doesn't mean that it can't continue to exist. What it means is it's a system that's energy intensive to sustain. And if you look at Facebook and if you look at Google and all these other platforms, they're always expending a tremendous amount of energy to sustain those same systems. When is it worth it? When the rewards are massive and too valuable to ignore. And it's obvious, especially to them, that they are. And these companies have grown to be some of the largest entities in the world, right? Surpassing the reach and the power of governments themselves. And if you look at how data here compares to oil and fossil fuels, there's a lot of similarity. People say data is the new oil. I don't read that in the nice way. What I read that as is there's massive externalities that come from centralizing these resources, burning off these resources, and eventually it's the consumers who bear the consequences, especially when there has been very little oversight over how this core resource has been used and exploited. So similar to that analogy, we are destroying the economic environment for the humans who have to live in it. And this system that I consider unsustainable, right? Because it's so energy intensive to maintain. There's so much energy being expended constantly by Google, Facebook, and others to keep us locked into these systems, right? They're destroying all competition insatiably, right? This destroys, ultimately, economic opportunity because that's what monopolies do. And these are not natural monopolies. We don't live in a society where data is a natural monopoly. We all generate it ourselves, and we all should have some ownership and consent over it. And it's our freedom that's put at risk when we allow our freedoms to be monopolized because we have to use these platforms. When they engage in regulatory capture, what's happening is we're creating an unsustainable economic environment, and one that is putting our entire society and our global economy at risk more than ever. So we're back to this, right? These are all violations of our privacy because they are violations of our consent. They're violations of our freedom. And most of all, they're creating an unsustainable world. And what I would like to implore all of us to do is think about how we can build solutions, privacy-first solutions that allow us to regain our consent and maintain our freedom and allow us to build a more human-centric, sustainable future. Because that is really the only way to save our privacy, is to care about all of these fundamental inputs into our privacy and seeing that our privacy is really what makes us human. So in conclusion, privacy is not just one thing, and it's not just those three things, right? It's really everything. And when it's gone, it's going to stay gone, and we need to act now. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I hope it explains why privacy is so foundational to everything we do at Enigma. It's certainly foundational to everything that I think about. And if you're interested in learning more and joining us and helping us build these privacy-first solutions, human-first solutions, less centralized solutions that we consider to be critical for a sustainable, better future for everybody, check out our channels. Hit me up on Twitter. Check out enigma.co. I would love to tell you more about what we're doing, but thank you for your time and attention, and let's build awesome stuff together.